The lessons of 3 years of war in Ukraine. Well, today we discuss. Well, sadly, we reached a milestone on the war on Ukraine, 3 years since the military operation started on Ukraine, and of course, 3 years of war is something that we don't want, as a humankind. And today we are going to review how we got here and the lessons and probable outcomes on such conflict. So let's start. Of course, this particular conflict starts on February 24 at dawn when several Ukrainian cities were attacked by the Russian military, including the capital Kiev. And it was, of course, a surprise. The world took it as a shock. And the war was, at first, it looked like it would be a swift victory for Russia, just for the sheer fact that Russia has arguably the second most important army in the world, and Ukraine doesn't have, back then, didn't have, let's say, that big of military muscle in order to endure such conflict. This war starts because Vladimir Putin, of course, the leader of Russia, had particular goals, but the most important one was keeping Ukraine as a neutral state rather than a pro-European, pro-Western, pro-United States state. But most importantly, that Ukraine must not be a NATO member. And that was basically the motivation for this particular war. So back then we expected the worst for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. However, apparently the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, had another plans. He famously said that I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And also, apparently after that day, he changed his attire from, the typical politician suit and tie to more of a military attire, basically giving the signal that he is at war. Of course, that's perfectly understandable. But also, most of the world at first, they show a lot of solidarity with Ukraine, led by the U.S. president back then, Joe Biden, and he basically said that he was pretty quick in order to help Ukraine with resources, of course, military equipment, supplies, logistics, things like that. And of course, the European nations also chip in, they contribute with this particular purpose, and also countries like Japan, and even countries like Turkey, they cooperated with Ukraine on this particular effort, of course, with certain conditions. The Western countries also sanctioned Russia. Now, Russia is by far the most sanctioned country in the world, and it was one of the objectives in order to hinder and stop the war, was basically making the Russian economy putting on the verge of collapsing, something that at first it looked a very real scenario, but that did not quite play out. And of course, Russia had allies of their own. They had China, although they were on more of a neutral, let's say, stand in order to, they were not heavily involved with the Russian endeavors, but still, were a close ally regarding resources and things like that, and mostly diplomatic efforts to support Russia. But it's not like China was directly involved in the conflict. So on the past 3 years, well, the first year was the one who had the most, let's say, events, regarding military operations. On the first few days, apparently Russia was poised to take over the whole country. That included attacks to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. However, just a few months afterwards, the start of the war, Ukraine was able to reorganize and they were able to actually liberate important cities. Of course, Kiev, the Battle of Kiev, the first major win of the Ukrainian army. Ukraine was able to liberate several major cities from Russia control, like, of course, Kiev, the capital, but also Kharkiv, Kherson, Mykolaiv, among many others. However, after 1 year of war, we know that the story, how it fully developed, it was an attrition war for more than 2 years, and these combats have caused several hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, and also including tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. However, the biggest highlight of the war on the past half a year or so, it was the Ukrainian invasion on the region of Kursk that allowed Ukraine in order to capture a small territory on this particular region of Russia in order to try to start leveling things out. However, after 3 years of war of attrition, the end result is that Russia controls around 20% of Ukrainian territory. Also, during this war, we had different nuclear threats from Russia's side. Remember that Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, and Western countries didn't took this threat lightly. And actually, one of the conditions, most of the time, when Ukraine got military aid from Western countries, it was the promise not to use such weapons within Russian soil. Now, the biggest game changer in order to, let's say, end this particular war was the election of Donald Trump. Without a question, that's a game changer for the dynamic of this war. Remember that the United States is the biggest benefactor of Ukraine regarding military aid, around 120 billion US dollars. That's the amount that the US donated to Ukraine. And if you combine the whole NATO and other nations like Japan, the amount is close to 100 billion. So what we got right now is that if the United States is not fully funding the war, or at least not on a remarkable way, it's impossible that Ukraine can contain this particular war of attrition. Remember that Ukraine is a tiny country, not only on size and population, but also on resources compared to Russia. And since Donald Trump took office just, well, like a month ago, we already tracked this particular milestone here on this channel. How this is going to affect the war? Well, of course, we know that Donald Trump has two particular characteristics that are completely different from his predecessor, Joe Biden. The first one, that he is very friendly with Vladimir Putin, and many people criticize him that he's like a dictator's praiser and let's say whitewasher, but I mean it's just reporting the news here. And apparently that, of course, plays in favor of Vladimir Putin. The second thing is that Trump, we know that he's an isolationist. That means that he's not too much in favor in order to donating money to other countries and actually not getting involved in other countries, maybe financially, with the military, or just with political rhetoric. So let's see what happens on that. But of course, that is a significant advantage that Putin has right now compared to having a Democrat on the White House. So right now we are on the verge of negotiations that might end this war once for all. Hopefully that happens. And the biggest thing is that, well, the lessons that we can learn is that, well, there are a couple of scenarios that are favoring Russia and a few others that are favoring Ukraine. Right now, Vladimir Putin has the upper hand, and most likely this war will end with on what you might consider a Russian victory, because basically Putin, Russia's Putin, is gonna get mostly what they want. It is what it is. First, territory concessions from of course, Ukraine. Most likely they're gonna get first Crimea that they invaded on 2014, and also they're gonna get 20% of the eastern side of Ukraine. That's the territory right now that is on Russian occupation. The other thing is Western concessions, mostly provided by Donald Trump and the US government right now. Diplomatic, economic, and basically with a lot of leeway. That is basically what Putin was aiming just a few years ago. Remember, on these past 3 years, Putin and Russia's Putin has been isolated to most of the world, mostly to Western countries, and that has taken, let's say, a hit on Russia's reputation all over the world. Sanctions, most likely the US is going to withdraw the sanctions that has on Russia's economy, especially on Putin's loyalists on the country, the military supporters, the oligarchs, the businessmen, and diplomats in Russia will see their sanctions lifted and the Russian economy overall. So that's going to be a very good news for Putin and Putin's Russia. And however, that not necessarily will be the case with the sanctions imposed by the European Union, but still we just have to wait and see. And lastly, and this is the most important key element, the biggest victory for Putin is that Ukraine won't enter to the NATO organization. That was the biggest demand of Russia. They don't want a country that close to Russian soil on an strategic location to be a NATO ally, a NATO full member. And apparently he is gonna get it. Trump already promised that it won't happen, and you need the approval of each member. And doesn't seem like Ukraine is gonna get so. Now, there will be a couple of other things that Putin is getting away with. And first is an isolationist United States. And this is important because basically you have an Atlantic alliance, traditionally, at least on the past 100 years, between the United States, Canada, and Western European countries. We see that on the first two world wars. However, that might end or at least diminish with the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House, and that means a weaker Europe, also a weaker NATO. Therefore, that means that Russia gets a stronger position on worldwide geopolitics and economics and military prowess. And a last perk that Vladimir Putin gets is that his political rivals on Western countries are getting weaker, and his allies on Western countries are getting stronger, especially on political capital. Right now, let's say Western rivals, you want to call them, people like Ursula von der Leyen, the presidents of countries anti-Putin and more pro-Europe are getting weaker on their political stance at any given country. Remember that most of Putin's, let's say, rivals live on democracies, and they have to worry about elections once in a while. And political, let's say, more friendly politicians on the West, like Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban, and of course Donald Trump himself, people like that are rising on those democracies on the West. Of course, Putin is not getting away with this, let's say, with some hiccups on the way. Also, he and Russia have suffered a couple of losses. First, they lost Syria, that they were the main military aid for Bashar al-Assad. Remember that Russia used to control a military base on the coast of Syria. Also, that cost Putin a couple of new members in NATO that are geographical neighbors of Russia and now are rivals, like Finland and Sweden. Remember, these countries were kind of a neutral stance regarding the relationship with Russia and the European Union. But right now, both are full members of NATO. Those are bad news for Putin. And lastly, we have, of course, the economic mayhem. Russia has suffered inflation, has to adapt and suffer some frictions during the war regarding their trade partners. They have to sell their natural gas at a discount rate to China. Also, on the commerce, on the everyday commerce in Russia, we had some hiccups now and then. The ruble has been able to stay strong after several interventions from the Russian central bank, but therefore hasn't been quite easy. And also, they had to deal with a significant brain drain from Russia. Now, Ukraine, despite all of this mayhem that they have suffered, the everyday Ukrainian citizen, there are a couple of silver linings that we can take from this war. The first one is the sympathy of most of the world regarding their situation. Now, Ukrainians are seen like a tough and resilient people. Most people, actually, everyone who knows Ukrainians know that. But right now, the whole world knows that, even the countries that are in favor of Putin. And also, they gain the sympathy of most of the world politically. Of course, that has been, let's say, that trend has been going down, mostly in the United States, because the war, first, most of US citizens, so with sympathy Ukraine. However, this particular war has cost the taxpayers, the US taxpayers, a hefty price, and some, let's say, former supporters of the Ukrainian cause right now are not on that particular stance because, it costs some money. So let's not discuss if that's good or that bad, but, it's still a situation to figure out. But also, Ukraine might have a possible European Union membership that will help a lot with Ukrainians' economy, and also that's something that the Ukrainian people were pledging on. I mean, on the polls, on their particular political sentiment since more than a decade, basically since the Euromaidan. And lastly, that Ukraine might become, let's say, very attractive for Western investments in years to come that hopefully will benefit the Ukrainian people. So that will be all for today. Of course, we expect this war to end already. And by the way, the day that happens, we are going to have our thoughts, right from the get-go. Thank you for watching Continental Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media. And if you want to work with us, continentalinsider.com. Thanks again, and have a nice day.